Okay, so, for this deep dive, you guys have sent in some really, really thought-provoking material about this whole idea of a brotherhood,
Yeah.
particularly within law enforcement.
Yeah.
And, the thing that really jumped out at us as we started, digging into all of this is that while the sources you sent focused on that specific context,
Right.
the underlying dynamic, it's like so much bigger. It's like we're actually looking at a really fundamental part of what it means to be human, this idea of in-group bias, or I guess you could say just like loyalty to your group.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the idea of this brotherhood in law enforcement is kind of a powerful, starting point.
Right.
But it really lets us open up this whole conversation about, this much broader human tendency. And, in-group bias, it's not limited to just one gender, despite the terminology. Right. It's something that pops up across every age in every culture. And, throughout history, it's been a force that shapes how people interact.
Yeah.
You've probably experienced it in your own life in, countless ways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like that instant kind of connection you feel with someone who, maybe comes from a similar background as you.
Right.
Or just like that natural kind of urge to support people that you identify with.
Exactly.
That's the territory that we're exploring here. So I think the goal of this deep dive is to kind of unpack this whole concept of in-group bias, figure out how it works, what drives it at a fundamental level, and then what kind of impact it has across all these different parts of life. And of course, we're going to be going right back to the information you guys sent in to give you a clear path to understanding this pretty complex idea. So let's start unpacking this, right? What would you say, like at the absolute core of in-group bias, what is it?
So like the very heart of in-group bias is this inherent human tendency to favor, to trust more and to feel protective towards people who belong to the same social groups that we do. It's this, this basic us versus them kind of mentality that ends up, really influencing how we see things and what we do. And, this preference for our own group tends to show up in some pretty predictable ways.
Like what are some of those ways, that we see this happening?
So one of the main ways is through positive evaluation, right? We tend to judge people within our in-group more favorably, and we often, we ascribe positive qualities to them, sometimes even without any real objective basis for doing so. And then there's this whole element of resource allocation. We're generally more willing to share resources, whether it's information or help or even, physical stuff, with those that we see as being part of our in-group.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's like you're just naturally more willing to help someone out if they're on your team, versus like a competitor.
Exactly. And then it extends to cooperation too, right?
Wow.
We're much more willing to work together with people in our in-group to try to achieve some shared goal.
Right.
And then finally, and I think this is especially relevant to, this brotherhood idea that you brought up initially.
Right.
There's this element of protection. So we often feel this, a much stronger obligation to try to protect members of our group from harm. And sometimes that even means bending the rules. And in some cases, even breaking them.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because, you mentioned earlier that this isn't just some like modern thing or something that only happens in specific kinds of groups.
Right.
So just how widespread and how deeply rooted is this kind of behavior, like historically and just kind of across humanity?
Yeah. I mean, the reach of in-group bias is seriously huge. So think about all genders, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we use this word brotherhood, which is obviously a male term.
Right.
But we see these same dynamics in female groups as well. Like think about sisterhoods or, sororities or even just informal groups of women.
Right.
They often show that same kind of strong loyalty and that preferential treatment that we were just talking about.
Right.
And then, it spans all age groups too. Like you see it from those, little cliques that kids form in schoolyards all the way to, the really tight-knit groups you find in professional organizations or, clubs for people with, shared hobbies, things like that.
So it's not just like official organizations with, like a membership card or something.
Exactly.
It's like it can be anything.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a universal human tendency, right?
Yeah.
So you find it across all cultures. Like anthropologists find evidence of this in every society that they've studied. Although, the specific groups that people identify with, that can vary from culture to culture.
Right.
But maybe the most fundamental thing is that it shows up across every stage of human development. We see these preferences for people who are similar to us, even in like really little kids.
Right.
Which kind of suggests that it's a pretty ingrained predisposition.
Wow. Okay, so it's incredibly widespread.
Yeah.
And I guess the next question would be like, how does this, this fundamental tendency, how does it kind of spread out and affect different parts of our lives, or even like major historical trends?
Yeah, I mean, the impact is huge.
Yeah.
So think about just human time, right? So we naturally dedicate more of our time, more of our energy to those activities and relationships that fall within our in-groups. And, that fundamentally shapes our routines, our day-to-day life, even like big life choices that we make down the road.
Right.
And then think about history.
Right.
In-group bias has been a major driving force behind countless events in history. Things like tribal conflicts, how nations were formed, the way social movements happen, how political alliances come together. It really affects how societies come together, how they interact with each other, and, unfortunately, how they sometimes end up in conflict.
And what about just on a more basic level, like, biologically, what's going on here?
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating area.
Yeah.
So evolutionary psychology has this, a pretty compelling idea. It says that that favoring our in-group probably gave our ancestors, a big survival advantage. So way back when, cooperation and protection within a small, tight-knit group would have been really, really important for survival. You're facing external threats. You've got to secure resources.
Right.
So genes that made people, predisposed to that kind of in-group loyalty, they would have been more likely to be passed on, right?
Makes sense.
And then on a neurological level, our biology definitely plays a role. So there's neuroscience research showing that our brains actually process information about in-group members differently than out-group members. Like the parts of the brain that deal with empathy and trust, they often show, they light up more when we're interacting with people that we see as part of our in-group.
Right.
And then hormones like oxytocin, which is known to, play a role in social bonding, that seems to, strengthen those in-group connections too.
So it's almost like we're hardwired for this in some way.
Yeah, to some degree.
But, this brings up some like really big questions, right? Especially when you start thinking about fairness and how we treat other people.
For sure.
Like ethically, where do we draw the lines here?
Yeah, and this leads us to, these broader implications. So even in fields like physics, you can actually find some interesting parallels, metaphorically speaking, at least.
Okay.
So think about, like the forces that hold the parts of an atom together.
Right.
Those are way stronger than the forces between different atoms, right? And in a similar way, the interactions that happen within a social system, are in-group.
Right.
Those are often way more intense and way more frequent than the interactions we have with people outside of that group.
Right.
And then in math, game theory models can show how, these cooperative strategies within a group, they can actually lead to advantages when that group's interacting or competing with other groups.
Oh, interesting. So even in fields that, we think of as being really objective,
right?
These social dynamics, they still pop up in in the theoretical models and stuff.
Yeah, exactly, in those theoretical models. And then when you look at logic, in-group bias can actually lead to, problems with how we reason about things.
Okay.
So we might be more likely to accept information if it confirms what our group already believes.
Right.
And then just dismiss evidence that contradicts it.
Right. Confirmation bias.
Exactly. Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And that's often fueled by, this desire to keep the group together and to feel validated.
Right.
And our state of mind is affected too, right?
Right.
So belonging to a strong in-group, that can give you this powerful sense of identity, security, social support, which are all great things, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it can also lead to feelings of, anxiety, defensiveness, and even prejudice towards people who are not in that group. And then lastly, think about belief systems, right? So whether it's religion or politics or some kind of ideology, These systems often rely really heavily on a strong sense of in-group identity and loyalty.
Mm.
And those shared beliefs, they can definitely strengthen the bonds within a group, but they can also, unfortunately lead to excluding or even demonizing people who have different views.
It's kind of, it's amazing to see just how many different areas of life this whole thing touches.
Yeah.
So I think, let's bring it back to the individual for a second, right?
Okay.
What are the effects specifically on people who are inside that in-group?
So if you're part of a strong in-group, there are definitely some benefits, right?
Right.
So you can experience that, that feeling of mutual support, that sense of being protected by the other members.
Right.
And it's often easier to get access to, to resources within the group.
Right.
There's that real sense of belonging and a shared identity, which can be really good. But there's also, there's a potential downside too.
Okay.
There can be a lot of pressure to conform to the group's norms and expectations,
right,
even if if you personally disagree with them. And this is really crucial, especially in the context of this brotherhood idea, right?
Yeah.
So individuals in a really tight group, they might be less likely to question decisions that the group makes or to report unethical behavior by other members.
Right.
Because they're afraid of social isolation or some other negative consequence from the group.
Yeah.
Like, a police officer might see a colleague doing something wrong, but they feel this intense pressure from that brotherhood to just, keep quiet.
Yeah. To not say anything.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what about the flip side? Like,
yeah.
What's the impact on people who are outside of that group?
Yeah. So for people who aren't seen as part of that favored group, the effects can be really negative. So, they might face discrimination, prejudice, unfair treatment just because they're not part of the us.
Right.
And that can show up in different ways, right?
Right.
Like being denied opportunities or resources, being subject to negative stereotypes, and in really extreme cases, even experiencing violence.
Right.
And in the context of, law enforcement, like we were talking about earlier, this can mean a lack of accountability for misconduct if the victim is not seen as part of that in-group.
So,
virtues, right? They can help bring people together and motivate them to, to work together for positive goals.
mm-hmm.
But when that in-group loyalty leads to, discrimination, injustice, conflict directed at people outside the group, that's usually condemned by human rights principles, by legal systems,
Right.
So there's this constant tension between those two perspectives.
Right. Right. And this leads us to, I think, like a really crucial point, which is, the ethical side of all this. Like, when does this, this natural tendency that we have to favor our own group, when does that actually become a problem ethically?
Yeah, I mean, that is the key question.
Right.
So, while having some level of loyalty and group preference, that can be seen as a normal part of, how people interact.
Right.
In-group bias crosses that ethical line when it starts leading to unfairness and discrimination. So, like, favoring someone in your group over somebody outside the group who's more qualified or more deserving, that's generally seen as unethical. It also becomes a problem when that loyalty leads you to violate some fundamental principle.
Okay.
So if your allegiance to the group forces you to compromise your honesty or justice or just basic respect for other people, then it's, you're in ethically shaky territory.
Right.
And maybe the most serious thing is when it actually contributes to harming others.
Mm-hmm.
So protecting members of your group who have done something wrong, like covering up illegal activity within a police department,
Right.
that just perpetuates injustice and can really hurt the victims.
Yeah.
And in that specific example of the police brotherhood, any cover-up is directly undermining the ethical obligations that law enforcement is supposed to uphold.
Right. Right. Okay. So, if we recognize that there are these potential negative consequences, are there things we can do to, like, actively push back against the harmful parts of this in-group bias? Like, what strategies actually work?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely approaches that can help. So education and awareness are just fundamental, like just making people aware that this exists, that in-group bias exists, and that it can have these negative effects.
Right.
It can be a huge first step because then it encourages people to to think about their own biases and to be more critical of them.
Right. To step outside themselves a little bit.
Exactly. Exactly. And then we can work on promoting empathy and perspective taking.
Okay.
So encouraging people to try to understand the experiences of people outside their group, to see things from their perspective, and creating more inclusive environments where people from different backgrounds can feel like they really belong. That can help to broaden what people see as their in-group.
That makes sense. It's like if more people feel like they're part of the us, then the them shrinks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And for organizations, it's really important to have, really clear ethical guidelines and strong systems for holding people accountable. So in law enforcement, that means having, strong internal affairs processes, independent oversight bodies to make sure that loyalty to the group doesn't override, ethical conduct and legal obligations.
Right.
And then we should encourage critical thinking and objectivity. So get people to base their judgments and their decisions on evidence, on logic, not just who they're affiliated with.
Right.
And then having contact and collaboration between different groups, that can be really powerful.
Yeah.
It can help to break down stereotypes and build trust between groups.
Right.
And then finally, you need leadership that's really committed to universal values like fairness, equality, respect for everybody.
Right.
That plays a huge role in setting the ethical tone and shaping the norms within a group or within an organization.
So, earlier you mentioned these logical deductions that kind of relate to this. Could we go back to those for a second, just to kind of really solidify, what the impact of all this can be?
Sure, yeah.
So the first one, it was about how this whole in-group bias can lead to systemic inequalities. Can you kind of lay that out for us again?
Yeah, so premise one. In-group bias leads to preferential treatment for the people within the group.
Right.
Premise two, preferential treatment can lead to an unequal distribution of resources, opportunities, even justice.
Right.
So the conclusion is that in-group bias can really be a major factor in creating systemic inequalities and injustices, whether it's in a whole society or just within a specific group.
Okay. And then the second deduction was about, focusing on this brotherhood concept.
Right.
Can you go through that one again?
Yeah. So premise one, in a brotherhood where loyalty to the other members is seen as more important than the truth and then holding people accountable,
right,
there's a risk that people will cover up wrongdoing by their colleagues. Premise two. When you cover up wrongdoing, that stops accountability from happening,
right,
and it allows the bad behavior to keep going. So the conclusion here is that this kind of brotherhood, where internal loyalty is more important than their responsibility to everyone else,
right,
that can really damage the integrity and the effectiveness of the whole institution. And in the case of law enforcement, that can really hurt the community that they're supposed to be serving and protecting.
It's a pretty sobering thought when you lay it out like that.
Yeah.
So just to kind of really drive home how widespread this is, could you give us a few more examples of, this brotherhood mentality or, in-group bias in general playing out in all these other areas of life?
For sure. Yeah, this tendency to favor and protect your own group, it pops up everywhere. So like families, right?
Yeah.
Siblings might instinctively cover up for each other's mistakes, even if it involves, some level of lying.
Right.
In a close group of friends, you might see the group kind of ostracize someone who has a conflict with one of the members. And sometimes they don't even really understand the other person's side of it.
Yeah.
On workplace teams, you often see people downplaying each other's errors or, shortcomings to try to protect the team's image or, how well they're perceived.
Right.
On sports teams, players will jump to defend a teammate who, commits a foul or makes a mistake. It's almost automatic.
Right.
And in political parties, you constantly see this strong internal support for a member who's been accused of something.
Right.
And, keeping the party unified is often seen as more important than figuring out what really happened.
It's almost an automatic response, isn't it?
It really is a lot of times.
Yeah.
Think about religious communities, right?
Okay.
So members might be more likely to trust and support other people in their faith.
Right.
And they might be a little bit suspicious of people outside the community. Even in academia, researchers in the same field, they might be more likely to give each other good reviews and support each other's work.
Right.
And social clubs, fraternities, sororities, they're often built on these strong bonds of loyalty,
Right.
where you prioritize the well-being of your members. And even online, right?
Yeah.
You see this all the time. People in online communities will really fiercely defend each other against, against criticism from outside the group. So, all these different examples, the basic mechanism is the same.
Right.
It's that inherent preference, that loyalty that we have towards our own group, which, as we talked about, it has some potential benefits,
Right.
but it also comes with some pretty big risks.
So as we wrap up this deep dive here,
Yeah.
what would you say is like the biggest takeaway for you and for our listeners about this whole issue of in-group bias?
I think the most important takeaway is to understand that in-group bias is not just some isolated thing that's tied to one specific job or situation.
Right.
It's a really deep part of human psychology. It's multifaceted,
Right.
and it has huge consequences. It goes way beyond that initial example of a brotherhood. It shapes how we see things, how we make decisions, even the very structures of our societies, without us even realizing it sometimes.
And what would you say is the one thing you want our listeners to kind of think about as they're going about their day?
I'd encourage you to actively look for examples of in-group bias in your own life. Think about the groups that you identify with, the loyalties you feel, and then think about how those things might be influencing your judgments, your actions. And then take a look at the world around you. See if you can spot examples of in-group bias happening on a larger scale, in social situations, in politics, at work, things like that.
That's a really good challenge. And to leave you with a final thought to ponder, given that this tendency seems to be, rooted in our evolutionary history,
Right.
and given that it's got this kind of, double-sided nature where it can create positive group cohesion, but it can also lead to injustice and exclusion.
Yeah.
How can societies learn to kind of, to harness the good parts of group loyalty while still protecting against those really dangerous aspects of in-group bias? And maybe even more importantly, what's the responsibility of each of us as individuals in trying to find that balance? It's definitely a lot to think about.
Yeah, it is.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
This is DigitView.